Arrested unjustly by a racist cop while waiting for the birth of his child, Marcus is humiliated in front of everyone. Accused by a powerful businessman, his life turns into a nightmare. But when a devastating secret is revealed, the fate of everyone involved is shaken in ways no one could have imagined. It was a scorching, oppressive afternoon in Houston, and the heavy air seemed to hang like a blanket over the city. Marcus Williams, a 32-year-old man, stood anxiously in the crowded hospital parking lot. His mind was racing, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. His wife, Claire, was upstairs in labor with their first child, and he had rushed outside to grab her overnight bag from their old car. A 15-year-old sedan that had seen better days but had been faithful to them through the struggles of life. Marcus had always been a man who worked hard for everything he had. Growing up in a rough neighborhood, life had never been easy for him. He had seen more than his fair share of hardship. His father had walked out when Marcus was just 10 years old, leaving his mother to raise him and his younger sister alone. The weight of responsibility had fallen heavily on him, forcing him to grow up faster than most boys his age. He had spent his teenage years working odd jobs to help his mom pay the bills, sacrificing his own dreams for the sake of his family. But he never complained. Marcus was resilient, and that determination had shaped him into the man he was today. Now, as he stood by the car, the weight of those years still lingered in his heart. Claire had been his rock, his beacon of hope through the darkest times. They had met in college, both of them struggling to balance school and work, both of them determined to make something of their lives. She had seen something in Marcus that others hadn't. His kindness, his integrity, and his unbreakable spirit. They had built a life together from the ground up, and now, on this sweltering day, they were about to start their family. Marcus fumbled with the keys, the heat making his hands slick with sweat, when he suddenly heard the low rumble of an engine. A sleek, black luxury sedan pulled into the parking lot, gleaming under the harsh sunlight. It looked out of place among the more modest cars around it. Out of the driver's seat stepped Thomas Miller, a tall, impeccably dressed man in his early 50s, his graying hair perfectly styled, his posture radiating arrogance. Thomas was a local business magnate, a man who had built his wealth on the backs of others and didn't bother to hide it. His reputation in Houston was notorious. Ruthless in business, cold-hearted in life. Marcus noticed the car but paid it no real attention, too focused on getting back to Claire. He opened his car door when suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Thomas casting him a long, disdainful look. There was something almost accusatory in his gaze, but Marcus couldn't understand why. What had he done to warrant such attention? Before he could process it, two police officers emerged from behind a nearby row of parked cars, moving swiftly in his direction. "Sir, step away from the vehicle," one of the officers barked, his voice harsh, his hand already gripping the butt of his holstered gun. Marcus froze, bewildered. "Is there a problem, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but laced with confusion. His mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. "You're under suspicion of attempting to break into this car," the officer said, his tone cold, pointing to the luxury sedan. "This gentleman," he nodded toward Thomas, "says he saw you acting suspiciously near his vehicle." The accusation hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He stood there, stunned, looking between the police and Thomas, who now wore a smug expression, his arms crossed over his chest. It was as if this entire scenario was a game to him, and Marcus was the unfortunate pawn. "That's not true," Marcus protested, his heart pounding. "I wasn't anywhere near his car. I was just getting something from my own vehicle." His voice trembled with a mix of disbelief and rising panic, but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officers didn't even glance at his old sedan. One of them stepped forward and roughly grabbed Marcus's arm, twisting it behind his back as the cold metal of handcuffs snapped around his wrists. The humiliation of it all burned deep inside him. "You've got the wrong guy," Marcus pleaded, feeling the eyes of passers-by on him. "My wife's inside. She's in labor. I need to be with her." But his pleas were ignored. The officer forced him toward the back of the police car while Thomas Miller stood by, watching with that same look of disdain and indifference. In Thomas's eyes, Marcus was just another nobody, another man whose life was disposable. He didn't care about the truth. All he saw was a man of a different social class, someone he could step on without consequence. As Marcus was shoved into the back seat of the police car, he caught a final glance of Thomas, standing tall with his expensive suit and air of superiority. There was something disturbingly personal in the way Thomas had targeted him, as though this was more than just a misunderstanding. But Marcus had no time to dwell on it. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Claire, alone in the hospital room, waiting for him. Inside the cramped, stifling police car, Marcus could feel the weight of the handcuffs digging into his wrists. The injustice of it all threatened to overwhelm him. How had his life, a life built on hard work and sacrifice, taken such a sharp, cruel turn? The memory of his mother's struggles, of the years he had fought to rise above the poverty and pain, flooded back into his mind. He had come so far, but now, in the blink of an eye, he was being dragged backward into a nightmare. Through the car's barred window, Marcus watched as the hospital grew smaller in the distance. His heart ached for Claire. Would she know what had happened to him? Would she think he had abandoned her in her moment of need? The thought was unbearable. Tears stung his eyes, but he forced them back. He couldn't break down now. He had to find a way out of this. As the police car rolled through the city streets, Marcus's mind spun with questions. Why had Thomas accused him? Was this some kind of cruel power play? Or was there something more behind the businessman's smirk? Marcus didn't know, but he felt a deep, gnawing fear that this was just the beginning of a much darker chapter in his life. Little did Marcus know, this moment was the start of a harrowing journey, one that would uncover long-buried secrets, test his resolve, and ultimately reveal a shocking truth that would change everything he thought he knew about his life, his family, and himself. The police car weaved through the busy streets of Houston, each turn pulling Marcus further away from the hospital, further away from Claire, and further away from the moment that was supposed to mark the happiest day of his life. He couldn't shake the tightness in his chest, the gnawing dread that Claire would think he had abandoned her. His mind raced, replaying the incident over and over. The humiliation, the disbelief in the officer's eyes, and worst of all, Thomas Miller's smug expression. What had he done to deserve this? As the car stopped in front of the police station, Marcus felt a wave of nausea. The officers yanked him out of the back seat, their hands firm as they guided him toward the gray, foreboding building. His wrists still throbbed from the handcuffs, but the physical pain paled in comparison to the emotional torment raging inside him. "Move along," one of the officers grunted, pulling him by the arm as they led him into the station. The bright fluorescent lights inside only amplified the coldness of the room, making it feel even more sterile and unwelcoming. Officers and detainees alike moved in a slow dance of bureaucracy, none of them sparing a second glance at Marcus, a man wrongly accused and stripped of his dignity. After what felt like an eternity, Marcus was placed in a small, dimly lit room with a single steel table and 2 chairs. He was left alone to sit in silence, the ticking of a clock on the wall the only sound breaking through the suffocating quiet. His mind, however, was anything but quiet. How had things spiraled out of control so quickly? How had he gone from being a man excited to meet his first child to a suspect in a crime he hadn't committed? The door creaked open, and a burly officer walked in, sitting across from Marcus. He didn't offer a greeting, only a cold, detached look. "Let's make this quick," the officer said, pulling out a clipboard. "You were seen attempting to break into a vehicle that doesn't belong to you. Care to explain?" Marcus's voice cracked with frustration. "I wasn't breaking into any car. I was just getting something from my own. My wife is inside the hospital. She's having our baby. Please just check the cameras, check the records. I didn't do anything." The officer scribbled something down, his eyes never leaving the paper. It was as though Marcus's pleas were falling into an abyss of indifference. "Mr. Miller made a statement, and witnesses corroborated his account," the officer said flatly, as if that was all the proof needed. Marcus's heart sank. Thomas Miller. That name sent a chill down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas's accusation wasn't random, that it wasn't just about an assumption of guilt. There was something about the way Thomas had looked at him, like he had already made up his mind before the police even arrived. But why? Why would a powerful businessman go out of his way to ruin the life of a man he didn't even know? "I didn't do it," Marcus repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. He was tired of trying to convince people of his innocence, tired of the crushing weight of injustice. "I just want to be with my wife and my child." The officer didn't respond. Instead, he stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. Marcus was left alone in the cold room, his thoughts now consumed with fear. What if he couldn't get out of this? What if he missed the birth of his child? The thought was unbearable. For years, Marcus had dreamed of this day, holding his newborn in his arms, being there for Claire, starting their new chapter as a family. Now, that dream felt like it was slipping further and further away. As the hours ticked by, Marcus's mind began to wander to darker places. This wasn't the first time he had faced injustice. He thought back to his teenage years, when he had been wrongfully accused of stealing from a corner store in his neighborhood. It was a time when he had learned early on that the world wasn't always fair, especially for a young black man growing up in a rough part of town. The store owner hadn't believed him then, just like these officers didn't believe him now. His mother's face flashed in his mind. She had always been his source of strength. She had taught him to keep his head up, to fight through the pain, and to always believe in himself, even when the world seemed determined to knock him down. Marcus wished she were still here now, telling him that everything would be okay, that justice would prevail. But she wasn't. She had passed away 2 years ago, leaving behind a hole in his heart that had never fully healed. Suddenly, the door swung open again, and another officer entered, this one younger and slightly more sympathetic looking. "You've been given a call," he said, placing a phone on the table. Marcus's hands trembled as he picked up the receiver, the cold plastic feeling foreign in his grip. He dialed Claire's number, hoping and praying that she would answer. "Marcus." Claire's voice on the other end was shaky, but filled with concern. "Where are you? What's happening? They told me you were taken away by the police." Tears stung Marcus's eyes as he struggled to find the right words. "Claire, I don't know what happened. They're saying I tried to steal a car, but I didn't. I swear I didn't. I was just..." His voice cracked, the emotion too heavy to contain. "I was just getting the bag, and now I'm here. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I'm not there with you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, but then Claire spoke, her voice soft and full of love. "Marcus, I believe you. I know you didn't do anything wrong. We'll figure this out, okay? Just hold on." Her words were like a lifeline, pulling Marcus back from the edge of despair. "How's the baby?" he asked, his heart aching to know if his child had arrived. "No baby yet," Claire said, trying to sound upbeat. "But soon. You'll be here, Marcus. I know you will." As the call ended, Marcus sat in the cold room, feeling the weight of his world collapsing around him. But he wasn't giving up. Not yet. There was too much at stake, his family, his future, his name. He didn't know how, but he would find a way out of this nightmare. Somehow, he had to. Yet, the question that haunted him as he waited was why Thomas Miller had done this. What kind of man could stand by, knowing he was sending an innocent person to ruin? There was more to this story than Marcus could yet understand. Something much darker was waiting to be uncovered, and he would find it. Marcus sat in that cold interrogation room, the dim light casting long shadows on the bare walls. Hours had passed since he spoke to Claire, and the weight of it all was crushing him. He was still reeling from the shock of the accusations, the humiliation, the fear, the disbelief. It all swirled in his mind like a storm he couldn't escape. How could this have happened to him on this day of all days? His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp sound of the door creaking open. In walked a tall man in a crisp suit, his hair slicked back, carrying an air of confidence and authority. Marcus didn't recognize him, but something about him felt unsettling. The man sat down across from Marcus, placing a file on the table. His smile was tight, almost forced, as though he had rehearsed this moment 100 times. "Mr. Williams," the man began, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. "I'm Detective Henry Carson. I've been assigned to your case." Marcus sat up straighter, his nerves on edge. "Detective, you've got the wrong man," he said, his voice steady despite the desperation he felt. "I didn't try to steal any car. I was just there for my wife. She's in labor. I need to be with her." Carson opened the file, flipping through its pages as if he had all the time in the world. "That's what you say, but we have a witness, Mr. Miller, who claims you were attempting to break into his vehicle. His account aligns with several others in the area." Marcus clenched his fists, trying to contain his frustration. "Several others? Who else?" "No one else saw me do anything because I didn't do anything." His voice grew louder, more forceful, but it did little to sway the detective. Carson looked up from the file, his eyes cold and calculating. "I suggest you calm down, Mr. Williams. Getting angry won't help your case." The injustice of it all stung deeply. Here he was, being accused of a crime he didn't commit, while Claire was upstairs waiting for him, likely scared and alone. "Please, detective, you have to believe me. I don't know why Miller is saying these things. I wasn't near his car. There's got to be a mistake. Can't you just check the cameras? Look at the footage." Carson leaned back in his chair, his expression indifferent. "We'll be reviewing the footage in due time. For now, you need to understand the gravity of the situation. Grand theft auto is a serious charge, Marcus." Marcus's heart sank. Grand theft auto? His mind raced. How had things escalated so quickly? How could the word of one man, a powerful man, carry so much weight? And why was Thomas Miller targeting him in the first place? The whole situation felt surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Carson stood up, signaling the end of their conversation. "You'll be processed shortly, Mr. Williams. I suggest you think carefully about how you want to proceed from here. Lawyers will be assigned to you soon." Marcus was left alone in the room again, his thoughts swirling with fear and frustration. He couldn't believe this was happening. Why would Thomas Miller, a man he had never met, go out of his way to accuse him of something he hadn't done? There had to be a reason. Something deeper, something personal. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. It was from years ago when Marcus was just a teenager. Back then, he lived in a rough neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, always working hard to stay out of trouble. He remembered an incident involving a wealthy businessman who had come through their neighborhood, buying up property. There had been protests, people angry about losing their homes. Marcus hadn't been directly involved, but he remembered the tension, the anger, and the look on that businessman's face as he drove through the crowd in his luxury car. The businessman's name had been Miller, Thomas Miller. Could it be the same man? Could this grudge, this accusation, be rooted in something from Marcus's past that he hadn't even been part of? The thought gnawed at him. If Thomas Miller had been involved in displacing families from his old neighborhood, that could explain the man's cold hatred. But was that enough to frame him now, all these years later? Before Marcus could unravel his thoughts, the door opened again. This time, it wasn't an officer or a detective. It was a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and a professional demeanor. She introduced herself as Erica Daniels, a public defender. "I'm here to help," she said, sitting down across from him. "I've been assigned to your case." Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Finally, someone who might listen. "Thank you," he said quietly, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "Please, I need to get out of here. My wife is upstairs, about to have our baby. I haven't done anything wrong." Erica nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I've read through the preliminary reports, and I believe you, Marcus. But we need more than that. We need evidence, witnesses, security footage, anything that can prove you weren't trying to steal that car." She paused, studying Marcus for a moment. "This won't be easy. Thomas Miller is a powerful man in this city. His word carries a lot of weight." Marcus's heart sank again. "I know," he whispered, "but I can't just sit here and do nothing. Claire needs me. Erica placed her hand gently on the table, offering him a reassuring look. "We'll fight this, Marcus. I promise you. But it's going to take time. Time. That was the one thing Marcus didn't have. Every minute that ticked by was another minute he wasn't with Claire. Another minute lost in this nightmare of false accusations and misplaced power. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He needed to stay strong. For Claire, for their child, for himself. As Erica left the room to begin gathering evidence, Marcus slumped in his chair, the weight of it all pressing down on him like an anchor. He had been through tough times before, but nothing like this. This was a battle for his freedom, for his family's future. And deep down, he knew this wasn't just about a stolen car. This was about something far more sinister. Thomas Miller hadn't chosen him at random. There was a reason behind this, a reason Marcus had to uncover if he had any hope of clearing his name. But as the hours dragged on, and Marcus remained confined to that small room, the walls closing in around him, one thought plagued his mind. What if he didn't make it back in time? What if he missed the birth of his child because of this cruel, unfounded accusation? And what if Thomas Miller's grudge ran deeper than Marcus could even begin to imagine? Marcus sat in the cold, dimly lit cell, the hours dragging on like an eternity. He had been denied any further contact with Claire, and every second that passed felt like a lifetime. His mind swirled with thoughts of her, alone and in labor, waiting for him. He felt helpless, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. The injustice of it all gnawed at him. How had his life spiraled out of control so quickly? How could a false accusation turn his world upside down? As Marcus tried to calm his racing thoughts, he thought about the detective Henry Carson. There was something about the man's demeanor, the way he had seemed uninterested in Marcus's innocence, that left a sour taste in his mouth. It felt like the entire system was rigged against him, as though Miller's influence reached far beyond the parking lot. And what was the deal with Thomas Miller? Why did he seem so familiar yet so distant? Was it the connection to Marcus's old neighborhood? Could it really be a grudge that had lasted this long? Suddenly, the door of the holding cell creaked open, and Marcus's attorney, Erica Daniels, entered with a concerned look on her face. "Marcus, I've been working non-stop on your case," she began, sitting down across from him. "But I won't lie to you. It's going to be tough." Marcus leaned forward, desperate for any sign of hope. "Did you get the footage? Have you found anything that proves I wasn't trying to steal that car?" Erica sighed, flipping open her folder. "I've managed to get a hold of some security footage from the hospital parking lot, but the angle doesn't fully show the interaction between you and Miller's car. It's inconclusive. It shows you near your own car, but it doesn't prove you weren't close to his." Frustration bubbled up inside Marcus. "That's because I wasn't near his car. I don't understand why they can't see that. Why won't they believe me?" Erica placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression serious. "Marcus, you have to understand. Thomas Miller is a man with connections. His word alone carries a lot of weight. He's respected in this city, and when he accuses someone, people listen. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. We need concrete evidence." Marcus's heart sank further. It was as though he had been tossed into a pit with no way out. He thought about his life, how hard he had worked to get where he was. Growing up in a struggling neighborhood, Marcus had faced his share of challenges. His father had abandoned their family when he was young, leaving his mother to raise him and his siblings alone. Life had been hard, but his mother always told him to stay on the right path. And he had. He had worked tirelessly, putting himself through school, getting a job, and building a future with Claire. And now, all of it was crumbling because of a single accusation. "Please," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. "I need to get back to my wife. She's having our baby. She needs me." Erica's eyes softened with empathy, but there was little she could offer in the way of comfort. "I'm going to keep fighting for you, Marcus," she said, "but we're running out of time. The court date is set for tomorrow, and unless we can find something concrete, the charges will move forward." Marcus felt as though the world had been pulled out from under him. Tomorrow. It was happening too fast. His entire life, his future with Claire, hung in the balance. And he wasn't even sure why this was happening to him. As Erica prepared to leave, Marcus couldn't hold back his thoughts any longer. "What does Thomas Miller have against me?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion. "I don't even know him. Why is he doing this?" Erica paused at the door, her expression unreadable. "That's what I've been trying to figure out," she admitted. "There's something deeper going on here, Marcus. I've been doing some digging into Miller's past and, well, let's just say there are things about him that don't add up." Marcus's heart raced. "What do you mean?" Erica hesitated, as if weighing whether to tell him. Finally, she spoke. "It turns out Miller has been involved in some shady business deals over the years. A lot of people have lost their homes and livelihoods because of him. And I found something else. He owns a property development company. Years ago, that company bought up a lot of land in poorer neighborhoods, displacing families." A cold chill ran down Marcus's spine. He had known it. The connection to his past was more than a coincidence. "My old neighborhood," he muttered, more to himself than to Erica. "He was the one behind it all." Erica nodded, her face grim. "I think this goes back a long way, Marcus. It's possible that Miller sees you as a threat, or maybe this is some kind of twisted power play. Either way, we need to find out more." Marcus was left reeling from the revelation. If Miller had been behind the destruction of his old neighborhood, it meant that this wasn't just about a misunderstanding in a parking lot. This was personal. But how could Miller still hold a grudge after all these years? And why target Marcus now at the most critical moment of his life? As Erica left, promising to return with more information, Marcus sat in the silence of his cell, his thoughts racing. His heart ached for Claire, who was likely still in labor, wondering where he was. He hated the idea of her going through this alone. But another thought gnawed at him, something he couldn't shake. Why had Miller gone after him specifically? There had to be more to the story, more to the connection between them. And as the hours passed, Marcus's resolve hardened. He wasn't just going to let this happen. He would fight with everything he had, not just for himself, but for Claire, for their child, and for all the people who had been hurt by men like Thomas Miller. The following morning, Marcus was awoken early by the sound of footsteps outside his cell. The officer on duty came to unlock the door, his expression unreadable. "It's time," the officer said, gesturing for Marcus to follow him. With a deep breath, Marcus stood, feeling the weight of the day ahead of him. The trial was about to begin, and his fate was in the hands of people who didn't know him, who might not care about the truth. But Marcus had something they didn't. He had the truth on his side. As he walked down the long corridor toward the courtroom, Marcus thought about everything he had been through. His childhood, his struggles, his triumphs. He had faced hardship before, but this was different. This was a fight for his future, and he wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. But as the courtroom doors loomed ahead, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the darkest truths were still waiting to be uncovered, and that when they came to light, nothing would ever be the same again. As Marcus stepped into the courtroom, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on his chest. The room was sterile, cold, and intimidating, with the judge seated high above, gazing down upon him. The gallery was filled with strangers, each face an unreadable mask. Thomas Miller sat confidently at a table with his legal team, a smug expression dancing on his lips as if he had already won. Marcus's lawyer, Erica Daniels, stood by his side, her face serious yet determined. As they took their seats, Marcus's heart raced. His mind was still clouded with thoughts of Claire, wondering if she had given birth yet, wondering if she was okay. The cruel irony of being in a courtroom fighting for his freedom while his wife gave birth to their child filled him with overwhelming sorrow. As the proceedings began, the prosecutor wasted no time. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear," she began, her voice sharp and confident. Thomas Miller witnessed the defendant, Marcus Williams, attempting to break into his vehicle. The police arrived and found Mr. Williams in close proximity to the car. "It is an open and shut case of attempted theft." Marcus clenched his fists under the table, biting back his frustration. It wasn't true, none of it was. Yet here he was, fighting for his life against a lie. Erica rose to her feet, her voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, this case is anything but open and shut. My client, Marcus Williams, is an innocent man. He was in that parking lot waiting for news of his wife, who was in labor upstairs. He had no intention of committing a crime, and the supposed witness, Thomas Miller, has yet to provide any solid evidence beyond his own word." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked between the two parties. "Ms. Daniels, does the defense have any additional evidence to submit?" Erica nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. We have requested security footage from the hospital parking lot, but it's unclear. However, we have reason to believe there is a deeper motive behind Mr. Miller's accusation. This is not just a random incident, but rather a personal vendetta." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Marcus could feel eyes shifting toward him, but he focused on Erica's words. She was fighting for him, and he needed to hold on to hope. The judge raised an eyebrow. "A vendetta, Ms. Daniels? Against Mr. Williams? Please elaborate." Erica took a deep breath, preparing to reveal the research she had been conducting. "Your Honor, Thomas Miller has a history of questionable business practices, including property acquisitions that have displaced families from low-income neighborhoods. One such neighborhood was where Mr. Williams grew up." The room grew tense as Erica continued. "Mr. Williams's family was directly affected by one of these acquisitions. Years ago, Mr. Miller's company forced his mother and siblings out of their home, leaving them with nowhere to go. My client believes this may be the reason Mr. Miller has targeted him now, because he represents a painful part of his past." Thomas Miller's face darkened at the mention of his company's actions. He shifted in his seat, his smug demeanor slipping just slightly. Marcus watched him carefully, noting the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. It was the first sign of weakness he had seen in the man. The judge leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Mr. Miller, is this true? Did your company forcibly remove Mr. Williams's family from their home?" Miller's lawyer quickly stood up, trying to regain control of the situation. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. We are here to address the matter of theft, not property disputes from years ago." But the judge wasn't easily swayed. "It seems relevant enough, Counselor. I'd like to hear from Mr. Miller." Miller's lawyer reluctantly sat down, leaving Thomas to face the judge. He hesitated for a moment, the confidence draining from his expression. "Yes, Your Honor," he finally admitted. "My company acquired properties in that neighborhood, and Mr. Williams's family was among those displaced. But that has nothing to do with this case." Erica seized the opportunity. "Your Honor, we believe that Mr. Miller's actions back then planted the seed for this current situation. He holds power and influence, and he has used it to intimidate and manipulate others. This is not a case of theft. This is a case of revenge." The courtroom fell silent as Erica's words hung in the air. Marcus could feel the tension, the sense that something was shifting. But even as hope flickered in his chest, he couldn't help but wonder, was it enough? Could the truth really come to light in time to save him? The prosecutor wasn't finished, though. "Your Honor, while the defense paints a sympathetic picture of Mr. Williams's past, the fact remains that he was caught near Mr. Miller's car. Regardless of any previous grievances, the law is the law. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Mr. Miller acted within his rights to report suspicious activity." Marcus's stomach churned. He was trapped, caught between two opposing forces, one wielding power and privilege, the other fighting for justice. It seemed that no matter how much truth Erica brought to light, the system was still stacked against him. As the arguments continued, Marcus's mind drifted back to Claire once more. He longed to be with her, to hold their child in his arms and be the father he had always dreamed of becoming. Instead, he was here, in a courtroom, watching his life unravel before his eyes. Then, suddenly, the door to the courtroom opened, and a figure entered. A nurse, dressed in scrubs, carrying a bundle in her arms. The sight of her immediately caught Marcus's attention. He recognized her from the hospital. "Your Honor, the nurse said, her voice urgent. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have something important for Mr. Williams." The judge, surprised by the interruption, motioned for her to approach. Marcus's heart raced as the nurse walked toward him, her arms cradling the small bundle. His breath caught in his throat as she reached him and gently placed the bundle in his arms. "It's your son, Mr. Williams," the nurse whispered softly. "Claire gave birth a few hours ago. She wanted you to meet him." Tears welled up in Marcus's eyes as he looked down at the tiny face of his newborn son. His heart swelled with emotion, and for a moment, the weight of the courtroom, the trial, and everything else faded away. He was holding his child, his son. A new life, pure and innocent, untouched by the chaos surrounding them. The courtroom had fallen silent, all eyes on Marcus as he held his son for the first time. Even the judge seemed moved by the sight. In that moment, Marcus felt a surge of strength, a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for his family. The nurse stepped back, leaving Marcus with his son in his arms. Erica approached him, her eyes filled with understanding. "Marcus," she said softly, "this isn't over. We'll keep fighting. For you, for Claire, and for your son." As Marcus gazed down at his son, he knew that she was right. The fight wasn't over. But now, more than ever, he had something worth fighting for. The sight of his newborn son filled Marcus with a profound sense of hope and purpose, but the storm surrounding him was far from over. The trial continued, and although holding his child brought him a moment of peace, Marcus knew he was still facing an uphill battle. He kissed the tiny forehead of his son and gently handed him back to the nurse. As she left the courtroom, Erica squeezed Marcus's shoulder, a quiet gesture of support before the trial resumed. The courtroom was no longer just a place of tension. It was now filled with a strange mixture of hope and anticipation. Marcus could feel the eyes of the jury on him, their expressions softened by the scene they had just witnessed. But his battle wasn't one that could be won by sympathy alone. They still had to tear down the lies and get to the truth. "Your Honor," Erica began as the trial resumed, her voice steady, "we have evidence that directly challenges the testimony of Mr. Miller and sheds light on his motivations." She nodded toward the back of the courtroom, and a young woman stood up. She was slender, with long brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail, her face pale but determined. Marcus didn't recognize her, but he could see the unease on Thomas Miller's face the moment she stood. "This is Jennifer Reed," Erica said, motioning for the woman to approach the stand. She was a former employee at one of Mr. Miller's companies, and her testimony will shed light on the circumstances leading up to Mr. Williams's arrest. As Jennifer took her seat at the witness stand, Marcus could feel the tension rising. Erica asked her to tell the court about her experience working for Thomas Miller. Jennifer hesitated at first, glancing nervously toward Thomas, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair. But when she began speaking, her voice was strong. "I worked as Mr. Miller's assistant for 3 years," Jennifer began, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "During that time, I witnessed him use his influence and power to manipulate situations, often at the expense of others. He pressured people, took advantage of those with less power, and did things that were morally wrong." The courtroom was silent, everyone hanging on her every word. Thomas's lawyer immediately objected, but the judge allowed Jennifer to continue. "One incident in particular stands out," she said, her voice cracking slightly as she recalled the memory. "Several years ago, there was a family that was forced out of their home because Mr. Miller's company acquired the land. That family was Marcus Williams's family. I was in the room when Mr. Miller received the news that they had been displaced, and I remember how he spoke about them." She paused, tears welling in her eyes. He didn't care about what happened to them. He only cared about the profit. Marcus's stomach turned as Jennifer recounted the cold reality of Thomas Miller's actions. His worst fears were being confirmed. The reason his family had suffered, the reason they had been forced out of their home all those years ago, was because of this man. This man who now sat across the courtroom, using the same power and influence to ruin Marcus's life. "But that's not all," Jennifer continued, her voice growing stronger. When Mr. Williams was arrested in the parking lot, I overheard a conversation between Mr. Miller and one of his associates. He said, she hesitated, as if afraid to repeat the words. "Please, Ms. Reed," Erica encouraged. "Tell the court exactly what you heard." Jennifer took a deep breath, steadying herself. He said, "It's payback for what his family cost me." Gasps filled the courtroom. Marcus's eyes widened, and he felt his heart drop. Thomas had planned this all along. The accusation, the arrest, the humiliation, none of it was an accident. It was a calculated move, a cruel act of revenge for something Marcus had no control over. His family's struggle had been a pawn in a twisted game of power. The judge's gaze hardened as he turned to Thomas Miller. "Mr. Miller," the judge began, his voice low and stern, "is there any truth to this testimony? Did you, in fact, orchestrate this arrest as an act of revenge against Mr. Williams?" Thomas's face was a mask of defiance, but it was clear he was unraveling. His once confident posture had crumbled, and beads of sweat glistened on his forehead. "This is ridiculous," he blurted out. "This is all hearsay. She's lying." But the damage was done. The truth had been exposed, and there was no turning back. Marcus sat in stunned silence, his mind racing. He had always suspected that something darker was at play, but hearing it confirmed. Hearing that his family had been targeted, that his suffering had been planned, it was almost too much to bear. Erica stood, her voice calm but filled with conviction. "Your Honor, this case is no longer just about an accusation of theft. It's about power, manipulation, and revenge. Mr. Williams was set up, plain and simple, and it's time for justice to be served." The judge nodded, his expression grave. "I've heard enough. We will recess for deliberation." As the jury filed out, Marcus remained seated, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just been revealed. He had spent years wondering why his life had taken such a terrible turn, why his family had been forced out of their home, why he had been targeted. Now he knew. It had all been part of Thomas Miller's twisted vendetta. And yet, despite the horror of it all, there was a strange sense of relief. The truth was out. The lies and manipulation had been exposed for all to see. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like he could breathe again. But as he sat there, holding on to the small glimmer of hope that justice would prevail, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the end. There was still more to uncover, more darkness to be revealed. The fight wasn't over yet. In the silence of the courtroom, Marcus whispered to himself, "I'll see this through, for Claire, for my son, for my family." Marcus sat in the courtroom, his mind still reeling from Jennifer Reed's testimony. The air was thick with tension as everyone awaited the jury's return. Claire had rejoined him, holding their newborn son tightly in her arms, offering silent strength. Her presence was the only thing grounding him amidst the chaos that had become his life. The weight of the revelation hung over him like a storm cloud. Thomas Miller had orchestrated his downfall, and the pain and suffering Marcus had endured for years were all part of a twisted plot for revenge. Every injustice he had faced, every hardship his family had suffered, now made a cruel sense. But as Marcus sat there, a strange calm began to settle over him. The truth had been revealed, and for the first time in years, he felt that the weight of his past was lifting. Thomas Miller's lies and manipulation had come to light, and Marcus was no longer a helpless victim. He had fought back, and now justice was within reach. Erica, his lawyer, leaned over to him, her voice a soft murmur. "Marcus, we've done everything we can. The jury will see the truth. Just hold on a little longer." Marcus nodded, though his heart still pounded with uncertainty. He looked over at Thomas, who sat across the courtroom, his once cocky demeanor shattered. The man who had wielded so much power over him was now exposed for what he truly was, a coward hiding behind wealth and influence. Thomas sat rigidly, his eyes darting nervously between his lawyer and the judge. The confident smirk he had worn throughout the trial was gone, replaced by a look of desperation. For the first time, Marcus saw fear in his eyes, and it brought a bittersweet sense of satisfaction. The courtroom doors creaked open, and the jury began to file back in. A hush fell over the room. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the moment that would decide Marcus's future and Thomas's fate. Claire reached for Marcus's hand, squeezing it tightly. He glanced at her, the soft glow of their baby in her arms filling him with a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever happened, he wasn't alone. They would face this together no matter the outcome. The judge called the court to order, and the head juror stood, holding a piece of paper that contained the verdict. Every eye in the room was fixed on her, the tension almost unbearable. We, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Williams, not guilty of all charges. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Relief surged through Marcus, his heart racing with the realization that the nightmare was finally over. Claire let out a breath she had been holding, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks as she embraced him, careful not to wake the baby. The judge's gavel struck, but the finality of the sound barely registered in Marcus's ears. He had been vindicated. His name was cleared, and the years of humiliation and struggle seemed to melt away in that single moment. But the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, the judge continued, based on the evidence presented, the court will be pursuing a criminal investigation into Mr. Thomas Miller for abuse of power, conspiracy, and false accusation. The words struck Thomas like a blow, his face draining of color as the weight of his own actions came crashing down on him. The courtroom buzzed with the shock of the announcement. Thomas's lawyer immediately sprang to his feet, whispering furiously into his client's ear. But it was clear that the businessman's fall from grace had begun. Marcus watched as Thomas's world crumbled before him, the man who had tormented him now facing the consequences of his greed and cruelty. The satisfaction Marcus felt wasn't one of vengeance, but of justice finally being served. Thomas stood abruptly, his face contorted in anger. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice trembling. "You think you've won, Marcus? You're nothing. Always have been, always will be." But Marcus didn't flinch. He had heard those words before, too many times to count. And now, standing there, his wife and child by his side, Marcus realized that Thomas's words no longer held power over him. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady. "Your power is gone, Thomas. You don't control me." As Thomas was escorted out of the courtroom by security, his threats faded into the background. The weight of years of pain, fear, and injustice had finally been lifted. Marcus had won, not just the trial, but his freedom from the torment that had haunted him for so long. After the court adjourned, Marcus and Claire stepped outside, the sun shining brightly in contrast to the dark clouds that had followed them for so long. The warmth of the light bathed them as if washing away the remnants of their long and painful ordeal. Erica joined them, a broad smile on her face. "We did it, Marcus. You're free." Marcus nodded, his eyes misting over with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Erica. Thank you, truly." She smiled softly. "This is your victory, Marcus. You never gave up, and you fought for what was right. That's what made all the difference." As they stood together, basking in the glow of their newfound freedom, Marcus felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. His son, cradled in Claire's arms, cooed softly, and Marcus gently stroked his tiny hand, marveling at the life they had created together. The fight was over, but a new chapter was beginning. A chapter of healing, of rebuilding, and of hope for the future. Marcus knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he also knew that he had the strength to face whatever came next. As they made their way home, Marcus looked at his family, his heart full. They had weathered the storm, and now, finally, they could begin again. But just as they were about to drive away, a nurse rushed out of the hospital toward them, holding a small envelope. She called out to Marcus, handing him the letter with a serious expression. "Mr. Williams," she said, "there's something you need to know." Marcus took the envelope, confusion washing over him as he opened it. Inside was a birth certificate, a second one, listing Thomas Miller as the father of a child born years ago. His heart pounded as the realization hit him like a freight train. The child's mother was the woman Thomas had wronged, the one whose family had been torn apart by his greed. The truth, the final piece of the puzzle, was more devastating than he had ever imagined. Just as the weight of the revelation threatened to pull him down again, Claire squeezed his hand, grounding him in the present. He looked at her, then at their son, and made a decision. He wouldn't let the darkness of the past dictate their future. Not anymore. As they drove away, leaving the courthouse and all its secrets behind, Marcus felt a sense of closure, knowing that whatever happened next, he and his family would face it together, stronger, wiser, and free. The revelation in the parking lot had stunned Marcus. The birth certificate he held in his hand, naming Thomas Miller as the father of a child long hidden from the world, was the final piece of the dark puzzle. It connected everything: Thomas's hatred, his relentless cruelty, and the lengths to which he'd gone to ruin Marcus's life. For a moment, Marcus felt the weight of it all crashing down on him. How could this man, who had caused so much pain, be tied to something so profound? The child mentioned in the certificate was connected to the woman Thomas had once destroyed, a woman whose life had been upended in much the same way Marcus's had. But standing there, with the hospital behind him and his family beside him, Marcus made a decision. He wouldn't let the darkness of Thomas Miller's past define his future. He looked at Claire, who was holding their baby, her eyes filled with concern and love. She was his anchor, his reminder of everything good in the world. "I won't let this control us," Marcus said softly, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "We've come too far. We have a new life to focus on now." Claire smiled, her face full of relief. She stepped closer to him, resting her hand on his arm. "Whatever happens, we're in this together," she whispered, her voice filled with determination. "This is our time now, Marcus." They got into the car, and as they drove away, Marcus felt a sense of closure. The long battle, the years of suffering, and the pain inflicted by Thomas were finally behind them. The road ahead was open, and for the first time in years, Marcus could see the possibilities waiting for them. As they drove home, the air seemed fresher, the sky brighter. Marcus found himself glancing into the rearview mirror at their baby, who was sleeping peacefully in his car seat. A wave of emotion surged through him. This was what truly mattered: his family, their future. When they arrived home, the house felt different. It was the same place they had lived through so much pain, but now it seemed filled with hope and warmth. Claire set their baby down in his crib, and Marcus watched her, marveling at the strength she had shown throughout everything. She had been his rock, and together they had weathered the storm. That night, after dinner, Claire and Marcus sat together on the couch, their baby sleeping nearby. The TV was on, but neither of them was watching. Instead, they talked about the future, about their son, and about how far they had come. "We're free now," Marcus said softly, taking Claire's hand in his. "Free from all of it." Claire nodded, her eyes filling with tears, but this time they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "Yes," she whispered, "we are." Suddenly, Claire's phone buzzed. It was the hospital calling. Confused, she answered, and within minutes, her face turned pale as she listened. She hung up and looked at Marcus, her voice trembling. "Marcus, they found out that Thomas had another child. A daughter." Marcus froze. "What do you mean?" Claire swallowed hard. "They think she's been looking for him all this time. She doesn't know what kind of man her father was." Marcus stared at her, the reality sinking in. He thought of the young woman who had no idea the darkness that lay behind her father's wealth and power. "She deserves to know the truth," he said, his voice firm. Claire nodded. "But we also deserve our peace, Marcus. We need to move forward." Marcus agreed. He had spent years trapped in a nightmare, and now that he was free, he wanted nothing more than to focus on his family. But a part of him knew that the truth would surface eventually, and he needed to be prepared for it. Days passed, and the calm that Marcus had longed for began to settle in their lives. He spent his mornings with their son, watching him grow and marveling at the new life they had created. Claire returned to work part-time, and their home became a place of laughter and love, not the scene of past trauma. One evening, as Marcus rocked their son to sleep, he thought about the future. He knew that the scars of the past would always be there, but they no longer held power over him. He had found redemption not in revenge, but in forgiveness, in choosing to move forward with the people he loved most. And just as he laid their baby down to sleep, Claire came into the room, her face glowing with happiness. "Marcus," she said softly, "I think we're going to have another baby." Marcus's heart swelled with joy. He turned to her, his eyes filled with love and disbelief. "Another one?" he asked, a wide smile spreading across his face. Claire nodded, tears of happiness brimming in her eyes. "Yes, Marcus, we're going to be parents again." In that moment, Marcus realized that life had come full circle. After all the suffering, after all the loss and pain, they were being given the greatest gift of all: new life, new hope, and a future filled with love.